Hi everyone, it is Professor Chan-Malik again, and as promised, this is the first of the short lectures that I am going to record for you about Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Today I think I'm just going to do one, possibly two if I could get the time later. Just reviewing some of the stuff that we talked about in class about the letter to his nephew and the first section about the Black church. So I want to begin this lecture with giving you a larger reading of the text that I think can be used to think through Baldwin's approach, his larger message, and for you in writing your papers, you can think of this as an example of a thesis. So I am going to offer you a larger interpretation of the text that is going to be my central thesis across these different lectures that I am going to share with you. So my larger thesis is this, and I'm going to print this all out in a PowerPoint and post it on Canvas so you can follow along. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I will have it posted by the end of day or by early tomorrow. So my thesis is this: The Fire Next Time offers a prophetic vision of the consequences of this nation's racial legacies. So by prophetic, I mean that throughout the text, Baldwin details the traumas of white supremacy and anti-Black racism on the collective American psyche for both white and Black Americans. And he does so to predict how these legacies will shape the nation's future. Thus, why the book is prophetic. It is using his knowledge and his understanding of the past to predict what he sees as a vision. In this case, a very dystopian and dark vision for the future. Baldwin warns his readers that without a deep and forceful reckoning with white supremacy and its legacies, the nation's soul will be lost, and produce the conditions for what he calls the fire next time. So in the context of all of the uprisings and civil rights struggles, and violence that's happening in the nation at the time of his writing it, which is the fire. He says, without reckoning for the future, there will be a fire next time, and it will be even worse, right? So in order to think through the nation's soul, this past, and in particular the orientations of Black Americans themselves, he considers two religious traditions, one of the Black church and the other of the Nation of Islam. And ultimately, what he concludes through these explorations of both of these organizations, right, is that neither is sufficient, right? Neither is sufficient. They're both responses to white supremacy and both produce perhaps temporarily effective but not long-standing solutions to this nation's racial crisis. So he argues ultimately that it is white Americans who must confront the legacies of racism in order to produce and create this nation as a space of home and belonging for all Americans, all races, all backgrounds, across racial lines. And it is this reckoning with the past and this desire to disinvest from whiteness, which he argues is the only solution to stave off or to ward off or to neutralize the possibility of the fire next time. So that's kind of the larger arc of what all of my lectures are going to talk about, thinking about how Baldwin is predicting this very dark future of what will happen if we do not confront the nation's racial legacies, particularly for white Americans, right? And how he tells this story. So today, in this first video, with that argument stated, I want to return to the short letter that he writes to his nephew, also named James, in the first, the first 8 pages or so of the book. And this is the part that's called My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew on the 100th Anniversary of the Emancipation. And this is on pages 3 to 10. And I want you to pay careful attention, as we talked about in class, to the 3 central registers of his tone and his voice in this intro to the larger text, okay? Because he's establishing a relationship between himself and the readers at this point. You have to remember, it's 1963. The nation is very divided, right? And James Baldwin is saying, difficult truths and observations, right? That much of the nation is not prepared to hear. One could say much of the nation might be very reluctant to hear a lot of the things he's saying, right? So he starts with this letter to his nephew, and he establishes these 3 tones in his voice, these 3 ways of talking. So what do I mean when I say tones? Like, I can have an angry tone. I can be like the teacher and be yelling at you. Or I can be very kind and motherly and nurturing and have that, so the tone of his voice really matters. So he starts off, right? He starts off the letter with a very intimate tone. And we talked about this in class. He starts the letter on page 3 saying, "Dear James, I have begun this letter 5 times and torn it up 5 times. I keep seeing your face, which is also the face of your father and my brother. Like him, you are tough, dark, vulnerable, moody, with a very definite tendency to sound truculent because you want no one to think you are soft." And in that tone, you hear him establishing the tenderness in his voice. Yes, he's talking to his nephew, but he's also speaking to all of his readers. This is meant to be a published work, right? So he's putting his humanity, his vulnerability, right, his heart on the line in the very first pages of this book. Right? So he establishes that tone. So the first register or tone of voice that he gives us is that of a man, a human being, an uncle, a family member, right? A nurturer. And that is the first tone he wants his readers to hear from his voice. Okay, so that's the first tone. Then quickly, as we also talked about in class, he starts to segue into these very long paragraphs that we mentioned, right? He writes these very long paragraphs. And he goes into talking about how he hopes that his nephew James does not see himself the same way his own father saw himself, right? He says that his father believed what the world told him about himself. And that was the downfall. And he does not want James, his nephew, to fall into that same trap. But as opposed to kind of going down the path of criticizing his brother, criticizing James's father, he quickly turns to the contextual things, the things outside of him, the societal things that produced him, right? That produced the conditions for his father's self-hatred, for James's father's self-hatred, right? He talks about the conditions, right, under which Black men are born and raised and socialized in this country, right? And he says, like on page 6, he says they're not far removed from those described for us by Charles Dickens in the London of more than 100 years ago, right? Your countrymen were not there, haven't made it yet. Right? So she's talking about the really squalid conditions that African Americans live in and that they are not loved in American society, right? He's talking about James, his brother. And again, on the bottom of page 6, he says, "For here you were, Big James. Name for me, you are a big baby. I was not. Here you..." Oh, I'm sorry. He's talking to his nephew here, that he was born for a different reason than James Baldwin, right? He says, "You're here to be loved, right? To be loved, baby, hard at once and forever, to strengthen you against the loveless world." And so here he talks about how the world has produced him and his father, James Baldwin, and his brother, right, in this loveless space where they have had to grapple with issues of self-hatred and a lack of belonging, right? And for the reason that, again, to quote on page 7, they were black and for no other reason. But he's saying, James, my nephew, you are here to be loved. And I want you to grow up knowing that you are worthy of love. And so here he's still taking that intimate tone, but he's also becoming a sort of prosecutor and critic of the society around him. He's talking about the ways in which black people, black men in particular, have been socialized to hate themselves, to see the limits of possibility for themselves, right? And the dangers that accompany them in their everyday life. So he turns from this very intimate voice to this prosecuting voice, to this critic. And you see that he's kind of amping up his tone to be a little more angry, to be more kind of pointed in his critique. So the tone shifts there, right? And finally, as he moves into the final pages, on pages 8, 9, and 10, he moves into yet another register. And here is where you start to really see his background in the church, right? And the notion of prophecy in his voice, where he's trying to say, hey, you know, if you don't look at the world around you and understand that you have the moral high ground, there is going to be these terrible consequences for the nation. So as we talked about again in class, on page 8 and page 9 and page 10, he really tries to lay out in this prophetic tone, right, this difference, as he says, please try to be clear. This is in the middle of page 8. The reality which lies between the words acceptance and integration. There is no reason for you to try to become like white people, and there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. So he's telling them, you need to look at them with critical eyes and understand who you are and your full self-worth. And it's at this point that James Baldwin starts to launch into kind of his predictions, right? Or it's almost as if he's on the pulpit in the church trying to give advice and to give words of wisdom to his nephew. And he moves on to say on page 9, to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. And in this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. So he's trying to spell out the danger for his nephew, right? Now he's really taking this preacher prophet tone, saying these are the dangers before you, and this is how you need to confront them, right? And this is what the future can and will be like if you confront them. He says the black man has functioned in the white man's world, this is page 9, as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations, right? So he tells him this. He's like, these are the hard truths about the world. But on page 10, he ends with saying, this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven of it. Great men have done great things here and will again. And we can make America what America must become, right? This is his prophecy. He is saying we, African Americans, right, and committed Americans of all racial backgrounds, right, can make America what it must become. He says it will be hard. He says it will be challenging. But here he summons that biblical, that religious, that spiritual language once more. And you hear the poet and the preacher and the prophet in his tone. He says, "It will be hard, James, but you come from sturdy peasant stock, men who picked cotton and dammed rivers and built railroads, and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds achieved an unassailable and monumental dignity. You come from a long line of great poets, some of the greatest poets since Homer. One of them said, 'The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off.'" So there you really see the way that James Baldwin is embodying a tone of prophecy, how he is saying, this is where you come from, and this is going to shape where we are going. Your strength, coupled with your ability to see the reality of the world around you, coupled with your insistence that white Americans confront their own racial legacies, right? While you have a clear-eyed view about what's going on. So I'm going to end there. That's the kind of way I want you to hear the three registers that Baldwin talks in throughout the book. The intimacy of being a man, this idea that he's a critic and a pundit and someone who has this very sharp eye on American society. And finally, he is a preacher, a poet, and a prophet, someone who is kind of very beautifully summing up what is going on, using this language of religion and spirituality and faith, and predicting the future by drawing on the past. Okay, so that's the first little video to go over the first section, and I will post something about the Black Church and then the Nation of Islam later, and then tomorrow I will post something about how he talks about the United States in relation to the world, and finally his engagement with whiteness at the end of the text. All right, see y'all later. Let me know if you have any questions. All right, bye.